Kia ora koutou, welcome back to another episode of the Happy Revolution podcast. This episode is a conversation between myself, Mika, and Jonathan Cornford, who is an academic from Australia. I've followed Jonathan's work for quite a long time, so it was a real privilege to be able to talk to him about it. Jonathan lives and works in Australia, so this interview is our first one conducted over Zoom. Because of that, the qualities on our end is terrible, and the quality on Jonathan's end is pretty good. So you will hear the questions that we ask, but they are pretty poor sound quality. That's about it. Let's jump right in. Nice, thank you.
Cool. So it will be cool to start if you could please introduce yourself and tell us a bit about who you are and your areas of interest and your areas of study.
Okay, yeah, g'day. My name's Jonathan Cornford. I run a small ministry in Australia. I live in Bendigo, which is in central Victoria, in the southern part of Australia. Been here for almost 10 years now. I run a small ministry called Manna Gum, and Manna Gum it's named after a eucalyptus tree that's quite common in this part of the world, which is the European name. Manna Gum is named because it produces a sweet white gum, so it's named after the manna in the wilderness. And the manna in the wilderness is one of the foundational stories of what I would call biblical economics, and that's what Manna Gum's all around, is a ministry helping Christians re-encounter and relearn what biblical economics is. A long time ago, it used to be taken for granted that to be a follower of Christ influenced your whole life and how you conducted yourself in the world of money and stuff and property and all of that sort of stuff. And Christianity has generally lost sight of that in the last few hundred years. So Manna Gum's ministry is really around reclaiming that sense of discipleship in economic life. My background is I did a long time ago, did a doctorate in political economy, and that was sort of in the international development world. So I ended up after that working for Oxfam for about 10 years, focused in the Mekong area, Laos and Cambodia, working on natural resource issues, extraction and big infrastructure developments, how they were impacting rural communities. At the same time, I was living in a Christian community in Melbourne, which worked amongst homeless people there, people living on the streets. So that was an interesting time of life. And then so did those sorts of things for a while, ended up starting Manna Gum after I finished Oxfam work. I won't go into the long story, but that's the way things went. And since then, I've done a way of building up the Manna Gum work, done a doctorate in theology as well. So my broader areas of interest are really Christianity, economic life, political systems, ecology, society, you name it. What am I not interested in, basically? Art. I'm not very interested in art, I have to confess, unless it's music. I'm very interested in music, but there you go.
Oh, cool. That sounds like quite a life and some quite intense moments. Sounds quite intense to be working for that stuff for Oxfam and simultaneously doing an intentional community in Melbourne.
There were some intense moments there, yes, for younger years.
And sort of what you were talking about with biblical economics, some of the writing that you've done has been around Christianity and capitalism and the overlap of some of those things. Would you be able to define capitalism as best you can
Yep.
for us, and describe some of the ways in which it overlaps with our sort of social and economic and political spheres and some of those interest areas that you mentioned?
Sure. Okay. Yeah. So I'm glad you asked me to define it, because one of the problems with talking about capitalism is often when people talk about it, they don't say what they mean. And there are a lot of different ways in which people use the word to mean different things, and that can be quite confusing. So how I define capitalism is pretty important to how I then talk about it. So let me firstly say what I think it's not, before I say what it is. So a lot of people would use the word capitalism almost as a synonym for something like commerce or profit, being involved in business and profit. And I think that's a bad use of the term. So I think you can be, and thinking historically, there are plenty of forms of commerce and making profit which don't necessarily have the characteristics of what I'm going to call capitalism. So just by being involved in commerce or business does not make you a capitalist. So let me say that. Another way people think what capitalism means is any sort of, let's call it quote unquote free market system. So whether there's a market in operation, that's capitalist. Again, I think so historically that's a bad use of it, because there have been plenty of market mediated economic systems in history which you can't really call capitalist. So in the 18th and 19th century, Imperial China was perhaps the world's largest, most developed and most integrated market economy, but you couldn't call it a capitalist economy. So that's a good example. So I don't mean that. And also, I don't think by capitalism, I don't mean an economic philosophy, such as if you might hear that people use the term neoliberalism, which is an economic philosophy of certain people like Friedrich Hayek, Milton Friedman, people like that. And so that's a set of ideas that have come up with some guys who are economists and also political philosophers. And essentially those ideas are, I guess, an apologetic for capitalism, but you shouldn't confuse their ideas with an actual description of what capitalism actually is. So they've come up with their own ideas, but I would say what I mean by capitalism, the best way to use the term is to describe an economic system. And it's an economic system that centers around the core dynamic of endless accumulation. So that right at the core of the idea of capitalism is that continually using capital, reinvesting capital to make more capital. So you make money, you reinvest it to make more money, and you use that to make even more money, and it just goes on. And that is the core purpose. It's not money for something, whether it's a social good or a political purpose. It's money for its own sake. Is right at the heart of what capitalism is. So you could talk about that at an individual level or an enterprise level. There's a person or a company that is capitalist doing that, and that's fair enough. And you can find examples of that throughout history in lots of different places, people who exhibit capitalist type behavior, whether it's in ancient Rome or in medieval Japan or medieval Islam. But they're people working with systems that constrain their ability to do that. What is really significant, what happened in world history, was round about the time of the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of what we call the modern era, round about the 16th century. The economic system, the political economic system within Europe undergoes a pretty massive series of changes, such that it's takes on a characteristic of the system itself seems to be working towards endless accumulation. It becomes a capitalist system. And that's a world first in human history. That's the first time it happens at a systemic level. So what that means is, so I draw my core understanding of capitalism from a body of thought called world systems theory. And that's really looking at how large political systems, that's larger than nation states, so that's interstate systems, work to drive and constrain the behavior of all sorts of actors, whether they be states themselves, governments, or whether they be the big corporations or merchants within those, whoever, basically, that to look at the sorts of forces that are shaping their actions. And so capitalism, for my mind, is a way of describing a system that came about, around about 500 years ago, and was defined the European world system, and it expanded steadily from there to encompass the whole globe, such that today, in the 21st century, it's the only system going. We live in a capitalist world economy. It has subsumed all other world economies. So all nation states, all societies exist within a capitalist world economy. So you ask about the overlap with society and the rest of things. Well, the one way of thinking is not an overlap. All those things take place within a capitalist system. So we think about our social life and our political life all take place within a capitalist system. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm just wondering if it would be useful to explain, do you have more of the sort of historical context in that sort of 16th century period about how that transition to capitalism as a dominant system, economic system, happened?
Yeah. Look, it's a fascinating question, and there have been different explanations put forward for how a capitalist system or capitalist civilization, another term that's been used, comes about. Essentially, I see it as there's if you like, a perfect storm of a whole range of factors coming together. You could call them historical accidents, if you like. So it's not. I don't see any, to use a technical phrase, I don't see any teleological force driving so that this is something that must have happened or was inevitable or had to happen. It was really something that came about by a conjunction of a bunch of different factors. And right at the heart of that, I think the most important factor there are lots of factors, so there's technological change going on, there's economic change, political change going on in Europe, there's change in people's ideas, intellectual ideas, both religious and philosophical, political ideas. Right at the heart of what's driving it, though, in Europe, what sets Europe apart, particularly from the Asian system, where you have very developed economies and political systems in China, Japan, India, and so on, is the highly competitive nature of what becomes the emerging nation-state system. So the late medieval ages, we see the birth of competing war-making states of roughly similar size, who, to basically pursue their objectives in the world and also to survive, they are competing with each other. They're engaged in a military competition. This is at the same time that gunpowder warfare comes into being, which is capital-intensive warfare. It costs a lot of money. So to be engaged in this competition with each other, you need to be continually raising more money, and it's an arms race. So that amount always goes up. Remember, that's the nature of an arms race. So the arms race of competition in Europe also becomes an economic race. The arms race of European nation-state competition becomes a competitive economic system. That's so capitalism and the rise of the nation-state in Europe go hand in glove. You can't understand one without the other. You can't understand the European nation-state system without capitalism. You can't understand capitalism without the nation-state system. So that's there's a whole bunch of other stuff, but let me throw that in there as I think the most important dynamic. And to this day, it's that competitive, the competitive drive, the need for them, whether you're a corporation, you're competing against other corporations, whether you're nation states, you're playing in the competitive world of nation states, that continues to drive the capitalist world economy. Why are we finding it so hard to make the changes we need in terms of carbon reduction for climate change? Because no one wants to make an expensive cutout of fossil fuels while their competitors overseas are still using them. So that's what we see. That's a very good example. We're right at the heart of
what you've just said raises some questions around sort of the course of how we've arrived at capitalism and some of the sort of ways in which that's impacted people and systems, and the planet as well, critically. Yep. So why don't we just start with a simple question of like capitalism, what pros and cons in your view? Do you think that overall it's good, it's bad? And then there's a few questions around that we have around like whether it is the natural course of history, is the market a good way to allocate resources, and so on and so forth. But we can go into some more detail as we sort of unpack some of the merits. But I'm keen to hear your thoughts on pros and cons, good or bad.
Okay. Look, I know you're meant to say as an academic, it's complicated and it's a bit of both, but I'm not going to say that. So I'm going to give you a binary answer. I'm going to give you an answer that it is unequivocally bad for human histories, for humans, for you and me, and for the planet. And that has to do with my definition of capitalism. So you have to go back to, so I'm not saying that commerce is unequivocally bad, or being involved in profit-making activity is unequivocally bad, or trade. I'm not saying that. I'm saying capitalism, this system centered around the endless accumulation of capital, is unequivocally bad for everyone and everything. How how's that for clarity?
That's a good, clear, bold statement. Can you hack that for us a little bit and give sort of like maybe a little description of why you've arrived at that particular conclusion about capitalism?
Sure, because it is an incredibly powerful system that drives us in directions away from everything that makes for human and non-human health. We haven't got to the like a religious or theological side of this, but I also view this through a theological lens, as well as I'm happy to argue it just in entirely secular terms, but for me it's a lot more time effective to switch to theology, because that cuts through a lot of the red tape, if you like. Capitalism leads us in the opposite direction from everything that makes for human and non-human health. That is a form of, because the endless accumulation of capital, its goal is centered around an abstract measure of all things, which is money. So imagine that dollar symbol, get that fixed in your mind as sort of like this glowing symbol. And all things within capitalism must be reduced to some sort of measurement by that. So you have to reduce everything somehow to that. And it's an abstract measurement, which actually, once you examine it, has no meaning. It relates to no reality in the world other than itself. It's an empty sign, and yet it is the sign around which the whole world system is now being organized. That is the definition of idolatry, of false worship at its almost the largest scale you can imagine it. And false worship is not just a bad thing because God says it is, it's because it actually destroys the things that make for life in the universe, whether that's for us as individual beings and the souls, what makes for our own personal well-being and health, or whether that's ecological systems at a planetary level and everything in between. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. That's a broad overall view, and we'll get into some of that theology. But first, I thought it would be cool and useful to try and unpack some of the, common perspectives. Well, yeah, common supporting perspectives for capitalism.
Yes. Yep.
And sort of get your take on some of those.
Yeah.
So why don't we start with Fukuyama? Is it Fukuyama?
Francis Fukuyama. Yeah.
Fukuyama, who wrote The End of History. It sort of argues. Now, I mean, there's been lots of academic discussion around that book and around that perspective. But what do you think about the perspective of capitalism as the sort of natural course of history, and sort of like liberal capitalist democracy is kind of the end point, and we can't get any further than that?
Particularly capitalism as the victor in the competing realms of ideas and economic systems. Capitalism has emerged as the victor in globally, and that says something about the value or the worth of capitalism. Question mark.
So I guess there's a couple of things bound up in there. Let's just take one element of what his idea is, which is, so it's a teleological argument that Francis Fukuyama was making, that this is something, it's almost like an evolutionary force. History just will move in this direction. It's like Marx's teleology was to say that history is moving in the direction of the dictatorship of the proletariat in the long run. That's where things are going. Francis Fukuyama and plenty of other people say it's just the natural course of human systems and human affairs. Once you strip back things, quote unquote, such as superstition and the restraints of government and so on, we will naturally evolve in this direction towards what he would call liberal capitalism. And that's what we see happening. And that's what he sees happening through European civilization and things like the Reformation and things like that, is stripping back all those archaic ideas that were holding back the economy and holding back human, commerce and economic behavior. And once we got rid of those things, we had the Enlightenment, we became, smarter and less superstitious. We started to become freer, and then the natural course of things could begin to assert themselves and capitalism come forth as it must do. And therefore, that's what we have now. So that's has been one major form of apologetic for capitalism. It's looking pretty thin these days, I have to say. No, not many people hold to it. History has sort of turned against that course of viewing things. But that has been a strong, so the idea that capitalism is our natural behavior. It's right at the heart of it, sort of an anthropology of the human, to say that this is the sort of thing we do naturally, is to seek our own benefit and to want to make profit. So there's plenty of people contesting that. So I won't go into that. I think that's bunkum. I think it's not a good, even just to observe your own behavior or the behavior of communities around you, it closely would give the lie of that.
The second common myth or common perspective, which is that capitalism is the most effective force to raise people out of poverty.
Okay. Yep.
The rising tide. What is the saying?
A rising tide lifts all boats.
Yes. Very, very common. Do you have any thoughts about that?
So that's a very common. It's part of, I guess, one of the moral arguments for capitalism that's used, and it was still very strong. And there's a whole group of apologists for capitalism who argue, and essentially there's both a shorter frame historical perspective and a longer frame. The longer frame historical perspective is, and you'll see this in the books of someone like Deirdre McCloskey. She's written a trilogy of books, and essentially the line of reasoning is, before 1800, the vast majority of humanity lived in dire poverty and were all very unhappy. And then we had the Industrial Revolution, and it lifted people into a decent standard of living. It's incredibly narrow to think that, it's a poor understanding of history to think that the way people lived in all different places and all different times was lived in abject misery because we didn't have flushing toilets and we didn't have packets of chips when we wanted them or things like that. But, that's essentially what the view is. And, the Industrial Revolution has provided all these things which we took modern life, which makes life happy, and before those things, human life was miserable. That's one very simple view. And I think I'm caricaturing it a bit, but that's essentially what it is. Capitalism brings modernity, economic modernity to humanity, and that's the only thing that makes life worth living. I think it's incredibly shallow, at root, incredibly shallow view of the human. I'm often flabbergasted by it. There is a more recently in the world of international development, this is particularly the case in the 1990s and early 2000s. The World Bank produced a whole series of reports. So it was on a big push to globalize the economy and to release the constraints to economic flows of people, goods, and capital, so that development could take place. And it produced these series of reports to basically document how, as the world globalized, poverty levels rose. And they're using their measurement from you've probably heard of the World Bank's measure of absolute poverty. It was the $1 a day poverty line, and then it became the $2 a day poverty line. And they measure how many people across the world live below that line, and they produce series reports to show, as the world liberalizes and economic flows take place, what we would call capitalism takes effects, poverty levels have risen dramatically. It's been much more effective than things like foreign aid and all those sorts of things to raise poverty levels. It's probably, I won't get into the detail because it's getting into quite complex areas, but actually there's a lot of smokes and mirrors in the numbers the World Bank uses, and it conceals as much as it reveals. And again, it tries to equate human well-being with a dollar value, and there's all sorts of problems in measuring that, especially from one country to another country, just the way the statistics are collected and then compared across different countries. Any number, anyway, the short answer is I don't believe a word of it. So I've spent a fair bit of time in that world and analysing those numbers. I've seen it firsthand. So when I was in Laos and Cambodia, working with direct contact with rural communities, and at the same time, the World Bank and Asian Development Bank were putting out reports saying, look how the poverty level has so dramatically declined in these countries. And we could see life getting harder for the rural communities that we were in contact with and around Laos. So there were two contradictory stories going on there, and that gave me very good insight into the reality behind the figures.
My last question around these common perspectives is, I'm just wondering if you see socialism or communism as a good alternative to capitalism. It's inherently anti-capitalist, and it seemed to be yeah, an option that young people, particularly nowadays, are starting to pick up again. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are around that.
Okay. Short answer, there's a short answer and a long answer. So the short answer is no, I don't see them as good alternatives. Definitely not for communism. The long answer is it depends what you mean by socialism. So most people, when they talk about socialism, mean some variant of Marxist-Leninist philosophy. And I think that's a bad road to go down. So I don't think there's much life in that route. But there have been many other versions of non-Marxist socialism. In fact, they predate. So socialism, the term, is older than Marxism and older than Marx and Engels. They used it when it already had currency, when they were around. And essentially, at its core, really, it provides a counterpoint to the term capitalism, to say at its core, where capitalism names the most important thing that society is structured around is capital. Socialism says the most thing society should be structured around is the social. So at that basic level, socialism, yes, I want to say yes to it, particularly so the older forms, and there's older forms of what I would call a Christian socialism that I would want to endorse much of their, or see a lot of wealth in that thinking that can be drawn on. And in fact, unbeknownst to a lot of people, a lot of the alternative economic thinking, best ecological economics and things like that going on these days, has its roots in some of that Christian socialism. So that's my short and long answer.
Why the no to communism and Marxist-Leninist socialism?
Okay, so that's a longer one, because the form of politics is at the heart, especially that goes along with Marxist-Leninism and the predicated upon class war and the dictatorship of the proletariat. It is, and I don't think Marx really realised this, but it is inclined towards tyranny of some form of another. So it will just move in that direction, as history shows. Also, the forms of they really actually Marx is valuable for critique and not much good for reconstruction, is what I would say. So so in terms of Marx, I don't want to discount him. There's enormous wealth material, particularly in Das Kapital, in terms of analysis and ideas of his critique and understanding the economic system that is. In terms of what may be, I think he's really not that useful, and his in terms of how what is his understanding of how human anthropology and what's viable in terms of an alternative economic system is unrealistic and inclines towards tyranny in the end. His ideas are too simplistic. That's my short answer. And it's modern, and actually it's all modernist. So it's Marxism, as much as capitalism is predicated on exploitation of the earth.
Yeah. We learn a lot about Marxism at university. So I feel like we've had a lot of interviews where people have talked about Marxism and we've found them very, very enjoyable. But I think ultimately they do fall short in a lot of ways. Can we transition to the next question, which is talking about the historical and contemporary relationship between religion, specifically Christianity, and capitalism, and kind of how that's changed over time. Is there anywhere that you want to start specifically? We could start with the relationship between Christianity and capitalism in terms of Weber, because that's the easiest one to start with.
Weber's a good place to start. So Weber's famous thesis, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, has generally been understood, hugely influential thesis in the 20th century, mostly taken up by people who never read it and just caricatured his ideas into a very simple thesis, which went something like, Protestantism created capitalism. That's how a lot of people understood Weber. Now, he is arguing for some sort of causal link between Protestantism and capitalism. His arguments are more complex than that. He's quite a sophisticated thinker, and he's got a very good grasp of economic history. So a lot of the things I described as the sorts of factors combining to form capitalism, he was quite early in identifying. But he does see a causal link between the religious change in Europe and the rise of capitalism. Very briefly, I won't go into the details. I and many others, and I think generally the consensus is that Weber was wrong historically around that. So particularly how he understood Calvinism, what he called his ideal type of Calvinism is not something that can be squared with the actual history of how Calvinism emerged and evolved in the 16th and 17th century. So at heart, his thesis, I think, was wrong historically, but it was an enormously fruitful enterprise, and the sorts of questions he was asking has prompted all sorts of people to continue asking interesting questions around how religion affects our economic ethics and so on, and economic behaviour. I think a better answer was provided, or not so much answer, but a better version provided by the economic historian R.H. Tawney. And again, his book has often had a caricatured understanding for lots of people who never actually read it, and they thought he was saying the same thing as Weber when he wasn't. He was largely refuting Weber. So whereas Weber was looking for to explain the rise of capitalism via changes in religious ideas, what Tawney was doing was almost the opposite. He was looking to explain change in religious ideas, change in the understanding of Christianity in relation to the changing economic world. So to put it simply, so his famous book, Religion and the Rise of Capitalism, Tawney argues that the emergence of capitalism at a time of huge flux in the religious ideas of Europe, that is the Reformation, through and it's quite a complex story, a whole series of factors, basically over a 2th century period, ended up changing Christianity. Capitalism changed the shape of European Christianity. So the very simple thesis would be to say, prior to the Reformation, prior to the ideas of capitalism could not be endorsed within a Christian worldview, and that was well understood. By the end of the 17th century, in Western Europe at least, it was generally accepted that capitalism and Christianity went hand in glove. So that's a huge change in ideas. And so he wants to trace how did that happen. And there's a whole bunch of things there, but what he sees really being unleashed is what he sees the core spiritual individualism of Protestantism and how that was affected in the changing currents of the world at the time.
And that moves us nicely to a discussion of, you said Christianity prior to all of this flux and historical change at the time would not have endorsed capitalism, and that was widely understood. So, I mean, it seems to me like that's not widely understood now. And yes, I know many Christians who have varying and differing views on capitalism, some of whom would say that they're not capitalists, but some of whom would subscribe to a capitalist philosophy and worldview as well. And they're still very faithful Christians. So how does Christianity reject capitalism, and when you say Christianity would not have endorsed capitalism, what are some of the, theological arguments behind that rejection, that outright rejection of capitalism?
Okay, great question. I'll try and keep it brief. So much to say.
Don't keep it brief.
Okay, right. Okay.
We want to have the most time for this particular question.
Okay, right. Okay, good.
Into it as you like.
So let me just say, So just to bring up to date what I was just saying. So what Tawney was essentially trying to explain to himself and to the world around him is, why is it, the question that you're asking, that we're, everyone's so accommodated to capitalism in the Christian world, when, if you read the New Testament and Christ says you cannot serve God and money, how hard it is for the rich to enter the kingdom of God. At a very simple understanding of the New Testament, these two things are contradictory, and that you can't match them. And that's what he's trying to explain. And basically, so at a very simple level, I think Tawney's insights, and he had quite a sophisticated understanding of his faith, and so he was a Christian. It's pretty clear if you read the New Testament that the economic ethics, certainly of the New Testament, and I think even in a whole biblical framework, it's quite clear that you cannot endorse the economic system which is centered around the endless accumulation of capital. So biblical economics is all around how does money and material things serve the health of the human community? And right at the heart of the health of the human community has to be our relationships to each other. So the sense of justice and equality that's between humans. There's an ecological dimension to that, which is quite clear in the Old Testament, our relationship to the earth and to the wild animals and everything having its place and its home. And right at the heart of all of that is, at the center of all of that health, is how that relates us to the Creator, to God. So economic life has to serve those things. It has no other purpose. There's no other purpose to economic systems than to serve that bigger picture of health. In the New Testament particularly, and you have to remember, Jesus comes at the time of the Roman Empire, when it's, if you like, quote unquote, global domination. So it was a world economy in itself, and it was the only system going. And Jesus has, in his talking around money and wealth, and this is really, I think it's staggering how little this is paid attention to in churches and in the general Christian world. Jesus' messages around this sort of stuff are invariably and incredibly negative. Jesus does not have a good thing to say about money. Let me put it that frankly. Now, that is not to say we can't find, but we need to pay attention to what the New Testament says, and particularly what Jesus says. If you are concerned to be a follower of Christ, if that's your framework, then we need to pay attention to it. And Jesus does not have a good thing to say about money. Why is that? Is the next question we have to ask. And I think the short answer is it's very clear in the world in which he lived, and I think there are a lot of parallels to the world in which we live. Money was an incredibly destructive force, and it was destroying things, both at a social level, but also destructive to the soul. So it was, we would use the word temptation. It's something that lures us away from the things that really make for life in all sorts of ways. And that's why Jesus is again and again selling people to give up their money to follow him. Sell your possessions, give it to the poor. So there's two acts there. There's one, we get that there's a sense of giving, of reaching out to the other, of mercy, and that's Jesus is calling to that. That's a really important component. But the other part is also the saying no, the giving up of this temptation to false life. And that's why he's saying, give up your money. That's why when the rich young ruler comes to him, he says, sell all your possessions, because that's what's keeping you from the kingdom of heaven. So it's quite clear to me, and I think that and many others who read the New Testament with, paying real attention to both Jesus, not just Jesus, I think it's the same in Paul and certainly in the book of Revelation, that the world system that we've seen emerged is something antithetical to the kingdom of God being described there. And in fact, I mentioned the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation is full of economics, actually. It's a fascinating book, and its critique of the world of the Roman Empire is deeply economic, and its critique of the beast and of Babylon, which is really its terms for different dimensions of the Roman Empire, are critiques of the economic system, and they hold very well for critiques of our current economic system. The language of the beast and of Babylon, we can all do some fascinating hermeneutics looking at a capitalist world economy and as described by the beast and Babylon in Revelation. So this was, I think, quite clear in the New Testament, and it was quite clear for the first 3 centuries of Christianity. So Christian communities lived by a very countercultural economic ethic, and that was something that distinguished them from the Roman world around them. And I think, and it's been shown by a number of people, was right at the heart of their evangelical success in the world of the Roman Empire, in a world where they were illegal, they weren't sanctioned, they were persecuted minority, and yet how did they thrive and increase in such great number in a world in which they could not advertise their presence, their public preaching was not a thing, what we call, quote unquote, evangelism didn't happen. Why were they so successful? Why were people so attracted to them? Because of the countercultural economic community that they formed. It was right. It's not the only thing. There's a bunch of things, but that's right at the heart of it.
Do you have any comments on capitalism and sin? I mean, I read an article of yours recently where you were talking about this topic, and you, I think, were making a point. I don't want to accidentally mischaracterize what you were saying, so do correct me. But it was something around capitalism inherently turns us towards our own selfish desire, which is a turning away from the will of God. Yeah, so if capitalism innately, as a system, seeks for us to pursue our own sort of best interest and our that sort of a turning towards the self rather than our neighbor or God, and in that turning away from the will of God and the plan God has for us, there's a sin. Is that something that you would? What are your thoughts around that?
Oh, that's very well put, Mika. Yes, I like your ideas there. I would say it's not a sin, and it's and I think that's one of the problems with the way we use the terminology of sin is we tend to think of sins as these things that we do, and there's some truth to that. So let me go back. We tend to think of sin as these things that we do that are wrong, as if somewhere at the door, before God created the universe, he drew up a black book of all the things you shouldn't do. And there's a list. And if you do those things, that's wrong. And that's a sin, tick, or cross, you've committed a sin. And it's these offenses against the rule book that God drew up before time. I say that because, no one thinks that really, but actually I think if you really probe deeply into both the language of how we use sin and then actually how we feel about it, it sort of does come back to something like that. So I don't want to say that capitalism is a sin, we've just done something that God said not to do, and it's fairly arbitrary. Rather, I think sin is much better thought of as an adjective rather than a noun, a thing that you do, but it's something that describes something that has happened. And at heart, sin describes, I think, this is a theological view of the Bible's, a summary of the Bible's language about sin. At heart, the terminology of sin describes a rupture in relationship. So right at the heart, it describes, going right back to Genesis chapter 3, a rupture in relationship between humanity and God. And that rupture immediately ruptures all other relationships. So when our relationship ruptures with the Creator, that fundamental relationship between creature and Creator is broken, then the relationship between us as creatures, so between us as humans, is ruptured. So you see that immediately in the relationship between Adam and Eve in Genesis 3. And also immediately in Genesis 3, the other relationship that ruptures is the relationship between them and the earth, humanity and the earth. So how we fit in with the non-human. So sin describes a rupture in relationship, and capitalism is a product of ruptured relationships and drives that rupture even further and wider apart. So it drives me further away from you. It drives the rupture with the non-human world even, and we're in the midst of a global ecological crisis. Is driving it to extremes. So in that sense, capitalism, it is sinful. Full of sin, but I don't want to. It's much more than just a sin. It's actually is the product and the evidence of sin, and it drives sin. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I have one final question to sort of expand on that point a little bit further and see if we can dig into some more detail before we move on to like what it looks like to sort of reconceive what Christians should look like. What being a faithful Christian looks like in the capitalist world practically. But I was just wanting to ask around this idea of capitalism pushing us away from God and away from other people. I've heard it argued that capitalism in its ideal form, provides a framework for us to help other people by pursuing our own self-interests. Do you think that that's true? And what would you say about that?
I guess that's sort of a version of Adam Smith's arguments in the Wealth of Nations, where Adam Smith says that by pursuing what he calls self-love, the butcher, the baker, and the candlestick maker. I don't think he said candlestick maker. It does rhyme. They don't produce all their stuff because they're doing their best for the common good, but they're doing it, it's in their self-interest to do their thing. But by doing their thing, they each meet each other's needs. Right? This is so at the basic level that Smith meant that. I think that's true. Actually, there's a level at which there's a basic level of providence in which each of us seeking to, if we need to take care of ourselves, and we do stuff, and there's all sorts of things we can do that meet each other's needs, and we weren't necessarily, that wasn't our primary motivation, but things work out like that. There's a level of truth to that. However, for that to be true, there has to be a certain coherence to human community, and I think this is seems to me quite clear that this, in Smith's ideas, it was predicated on there being this underlying sense of the thing that gives coherence to the human community, both at a bigger political level, but also at just a deeper social and cultural level. When that becomes the pursuit of self-interest with no bounds, which is what capitalism is, that all breaks down. And actually, I think Smith argues that. So I properly understood, and this is contentious, but there's more and more people coming to this view that Smith's arguments and Adam Smith's arguments in The Wealth of Nations are actually counter-capitalist. So he has quite strong warnings against what we would call the capitalists. He calls them the stock jobbers in The Wealth of Nations. So there is a base level in which people, going about daily life, can meet each other's needs, and that's true, but not pursuing their self-interest as in the capitalist sense to the nth degree, which is the basic dynamic of a capitalist world economy. Let's just take in the world of real estate, for example, people would say, well, me going out and buying up houses and then renting them out to people, I'm doing a favor, I'm doing something for the community because I'm making rental properties available. But the reality is, investors, and this is happening in New Zealand as well as Australia, I'm pretty sure, are out competing home buyers everywhere. They're driving up the price of houses, which is driving up the price of rents everywhere. It's a crisis. The housing system is fundamentally broken. They're not doing anybody any favors. It's a myth. That's just a small example of the lie in that idea but just by pursuing your self-interest and doing what you do, then you're providing benefit to the community. It has to be within bounds and within limits and within a certain sense of coherency of the human community.
Particularly as Christians, you've already talked about how Christianity used to live out, in the first few hundred years, used to live out an alternative to the economic systems at the time. And we've also talked about how Christianity contemporary Christianity is quite intertwined with capitalism. Mm-hmm. I am wondering what practically and morally the alternatives are for Christians to hold on to. I listened to a lecture that you gave a few months ago about your second doctorate, where you talked about Christians as a diminished moral force in society. Mm-hmm. We are now on the edges a bit more. You use the words humiliated and humbled. Mm-hmm. And then you also talked about repentance, renunciation, and thankfulness. And I'm just wondering if you could unpack and explain those to us. I found it super interesting in your lecture, and I wanted to ask you more about that.
Yeah. Okay. Good. So in that case, let me just first say that I gave a binary answer to is capitalism good or bad, and I said bad. In this case, there is no binary answer to say we just need to flick a switch and do we can just live in a non-capitalist world. And so the first thing we need to figure out how to do is how to live in the midst of a capitalist world system and do it well, and how to live faithfully to Christ in the midst of this system, because it's not going away anytime soon. That's the first thing we need to do. And then once we learn how to do that, we can start to think about how we get to a better system as well. That's the sort of the core ideas. And what does that look like at a basic level? I think the baby steps are really recovering our reading of the Bible, biblical economics, and the New Testament, and actually paying attention to what Jesus says, and being a bit more disturbed by that and wrestling with it. That's the very first steps, and then beginning to ask, well, what does that mean for what we do now? So let's just name our context a bit more clearly. So in New Zealand and Australia, we live, it's not just capitalism, we can be more specific. We live in the midst of consumer capitalism. It's a consumer system that is right at the heart of the spirit, if you like, of the world in which we live. We are both living countries that are immensely affluent. So that's an important part to name of our context. So I think the answer to the question is, how do we embody alternatives to capitalism, is contextual. So we need to speak to our context, which is first world affluence. And so a key dimension of that is coming to terms with just how incredibly wealthy we are. So most people in our cultures cry poor. Doesn't matter where you sit in the economic spectrum. Most people think they don't really quite have enough. I hear people all the time say they're not very well paid, and these are people on, $80,000, $100,000 a year, whatever, and if you spend any time in a developing country with people living in a country like Laos or Cambodia or from Ghana or something like that, it's just bonkers how we talk about, not earning enough money. We have so much, and we need to get our heads clear about that, and so right at the heart of the equation of living differently is to learn a new thankfulness for what we do have. So the three things you mentioned were repentance, renunciation, and thankfulness, and they sort of go together. So the idea of repentance, I don't mean, a lot of people use the word repentance to mean feeling guilty for something bad. You ate a whole block of chocolate and then you repented. I'm not going to do that again. I don't mean that. I mean, so the Greek word metanoia means to have a new mind, and it has the connotation of actually a new perception, a new worldview, if you like, a new way of seeing the world, and that involves emotions, heart as well. And so we need a new way of thinking about our place in the world and looking at the world. And then the next step is renunciation, a way of saying no to some things. So the world of consumer capitalism always says you do not have enough, and capitalism always says you should be seeking more. And the renunciation at the very core thing we need to do at the base spiritual movement is at some point is to say no. Say, no, I do not need more. No, I do not have to accumulate more. I have enough. And then the third and accompanying move, I think these all three things all happen together, is the movement of thankfulness, to see clearly what we have and how good the things are that we have, and to become thankful for it. So that's the sort of core spiritual movements, if you like, I think are at the heart of what's required of us in our context. What does that look like practically? So at a very core level, I think I would love to see if Christians in countries like New Zealand and Australia became much clearer that as a group of people, we can live at a lower material standard of living than the norm that is promoted in our culture. And to say, yes, this is a good standard of living. It's not only is it enough, it's something that we can enjoy and be thankful for. And so we can say no to more, and that allows a whole bunch of things to be possible. So we're not so there's a few things happening. We're beginning to, at a spiritual level, to say no to some things. We're beginning to participate in a different economy. So how does that happen? So how do you say no to more? Well, it means practically what that looks like is people being able to either choose to work part-time to give their time to other things. That's an easy example, but there's other ways. If you're, for example, become a doctor, then it's hard to work part-time. And so you could choose to only live on half your wage and give away half your wage, or support someone else in your community to do good work that they're really good, that no one's going to pay someone to do that work. There's much of the good work in the world no one is ever going to pay anyone to do. So that's at both the family level, the community level. So there are different ways that we can think about those economies of work, real work, good work that need to be done, rather than just, being out there in the world of full employment. We can think about our consumption differently, so that we are participating in different avenues of consumption. First step is to do less harm to our human neighbours and to the non-human world through our consumption. And then next step is to try and actually promote good, some sort of healthy relationship through our consumption. And that will invariably cost us more, which would mean we'll need to consume less, particularly if we're living on lower incomes. We need to begin to reclaim, to do some of those things, ideas of churches, this is a bit of a mind spin for lots of people. In the original conception of the church, the ecclesia, they were as much considered economic communities as spiritual communities. And we need to begin to really learn some of what that means to be people who, in sharing spiritual life, naturally share some form of material life together. And that can take all sorts of forms. Just the idea of a collection at a church where we pull together our incomes to pay for something is a very simple form of economic sharing. Well, that core idea can be expanded in all sorts of directions. Things like sharing possessions. We don't have to think about going all the way to how we imagine Acts chapter 2 might have looked at the time of Pentecost, but there's all sorts of things. But depending what sort of church you live in, if you live in a church that's reasonably local, where people live near each other, then it's things like mowers and whippersnippers and trailers and cars are the sorts of things that can be shared amongst people, and therefore reduce the amount of those things that are needed to be purchased within that community. And it's a mutual benefit to each other. Am I giving you I'm going on. There's all sorts of things we can think about, different ways that we can structure our lives. And these are all movements, I guess, if you like, ways of beginning to disentangle ourselves from the spirit of capitalism. So there's a spiritual movement, there's an actual economic movement, disentangle. There's no such thing as purity. So what I want to say no to is any idea that we need to find some sort of pure way of being, because it's impossible, and there's no such thing. But what we can try and do is increasingly try and shape our lives as much as we can towards promoting some sort of good in the world. That's the movement we want to. It's the movement of love, whether it's good for other people, good for the planet. To basically all our economic decisions are being framed within a much broader frame than just the idea of, well, how do I get more? How do I, what's my maximum benefit in this economic decision? So doing that personally and at household levels, and then to begin to, as communities, start to think about those things and talk about those things together as Christian communities. That's the starting point of regaining an alternative economic ethic and being communities that look different, think different, and then have something different to say to the world.
I don't know exactly how to phrase this, so I'm just going to stumble through it. But you've already talked about how, as countries, we are quite affluent, both New Zealand and Australia, but there are still people within our contexts who live within survival mode, who are working multiple jobs to pay rent. Yep. So I have two questions. Yep. One, is this message largely targeted to middle-class white Christians, in quotations? And then the second question is, what do you think is the role of Christians in terms of political activism? So what you've talked about is embodying an alternative in the way that we live, but also how do we engage with the bigger structures, and do we have a voice in the public sphere in that way?
Great questions, Rayne. Thank you for those. Yes. Okay. First one is yes. So I've really spoken primarily to middle-class Christians, which has been, unfortunately, I think the Christianity has largely been reduced to a middle-class phenomenon in in the Western world. Not completely, but largely. And that's only starting to change again as we have much greater migrant communities coming into countries. So that's where the class dynamic is again being unsettled. But for a long time, this famously happened in the 19th century, that the working classes just left the churches, and less so the Catholic Church than the Protestant churches. So they stayed in, but they've in the 20th century largely left the Catholic Church as well. Not completely. That's the big sort of social movements. So yes, I am speaking to what is the main middle class mainstream. We need to think differently. There are, and particularly with migration, I think the increasingly racialized economies that we have. So migrants, and particularly being forced into, the racialization of cleaning work and service station attendants, and what sort of work is available to migrant people, and the sorts of levels of social respect that they get, and the remuneration and so on. So we need to be attenuated to those nuances. There isn't a message for those same communities, though, whether they're migrant or not, whether they're settler colonial working class or new migrants, is that the point of relevance is that if we're in, they are also, if we're thinking about them as disciples, followers of Christ, in that context, just thinking with the Christian communities, if for them the core object is to pursue affluence as well, then they're as much in the same position as we are, just at the different point on the ladder. So the core challenge for all of us is to change the frame of how our Christian communities think about what we should be pursuing in life. So that is the same for everyone across class. It just means different things for us of the movements, sorts of movements. So those who are already tend towards either middle class privilege of some form or another, having to think about how to either use our privilege against our class privilege, which is how we can use privilege in the interests of others, or even counteract our privilege at times, and so that to make for greater justice and equality. We need to pay attention to those things. It's not a single movement for everyone. It's a contextual. We need to pay attention to the contextual nuance. What is that? So that moves us towards the bigger political questions which was the next part of your question, Rayne?
Yeah, activism.
How do things change? So that I should say that the sort of movement towards an alternative Christian communities, economic communities, which I've described, I think is really important and necessary, but it will not change the system. So if we do that thinking, that's how we're going to change the world, I think we're kidding ourselves. Okay, that's not the motivation. So I think it is essential and necessary, but it's not the same thing as then changing the system. So that requires being involved in that scary word called politics. And one of the core reasons I think we need to change our own economic lives and those of our communities is so that we can regain a new political imagination. Because at the moment, the danger for us, for Christians moving into political activism, when we've sort of lost all our heritage of Christian thinking about economic life and the meaning in the material world, where do we look at for the models and forms of political ideology or activism to join into? We just have to pick something off the shelf, essentially. When actually I think we've got much better options than that if we pay attention to the deep heritage of our faith and we relearn a way of thinking about the economic, the material, and the political world from our lived experience and from our practice. Then we can begin to encounter for want of a better term, the various secular ideologies that are out there. We can begin to approach them and say, okay, here's, let me take, say, the ecological economics movement, for example, which is all around thinking about how we need to restructure our economy in terms of more ecological sustainability. We could begin to approach it and go, okay, there's a whole bunch of ideas here which are totally fit very well within a biblical worldview of the purpose of economics. And in fact, if we paid attention to where they came from, they actually have their roots, often unacknowledged, in some sort of Christian thinking somewhere. And there's a lot of things we can say yes to, But there are some things, some parts of it where we're going to go, well, actually, I have a problem with that part, but that's okay. So we can think critically, but we can say, actually, here's a group of people that we can work very well with together around pursuing economic change. We need to have develop our own political imaginations and have them renewed, if you like, to help us then step out into the world so that we're not just going to be amenable to every shifting wind of political, ideology and activism. That's it. And I think that's I say that because I think that is actually a real danger for many Christians who quite rightly are really worried about what's happening in the world, want to change things, but there's not enough grounding in a Christian worldview to not fall victim to some potentially fairly dangerous political ideologies out there, even if there are some good bits to them. So look, Marxism, I would say, is a case in point. I don't think Marxism these days is probably the main worry, but it means we can identify groups that we can work with quite well and join. But joining a secular activist group doesn't mean you have to give your whole heart and soul to its ideology. It means you said, here's a group of people which I can find a broad ground of common agreement. We can work to common goals, and we don't share everything together, but we share enough to really work towards something good together. And it helps us see that I think people can see, let me use this term, people can come to seeing aspects of God's reality from different angles. So you don't just have to be a Christian to see some of the truth of the relational nature of the cosmos, if you like. So people are coming to that truth through things like the permaculture movement, or understanding the interconnectedness of things, how our health is bound up with non-human health and so on. And we can see that from a theological lens. They can see that coming from a different perspective. There are some broad areas of agreement that we can find to begin to work towards some things. So it's not just that they are like things, or they're similar things. We're actually talking about the same things with different language at times. We're not going to be the same in everything. Am I beginning to answer your question?
Yeah. I think one worry that I have, I've been studying recently in religion, the way religions enter into this public sphere, and how uncomfortable and awkward it is for Christians, particularly in our context, to enter into the public sphere and talk about our faith and theology, and having to translate that into the secular language and things like that. The Christianity that is already in the public sphere is usually dominated by a very specific kind of Christianity, which is conservative and uncomfortable. Yes. And so I just feel like we're at the very beginning, where it's just, there's so much work to do, and it's going to take such a long time to
and that's getting to that. So what you mentioned, the humbled and humiliated. So yes, I think that's good. Yeah. So the context for us in thinking about being politically active and in moving into the public sphere is that the Christian church has lost its moral credibility in the West for a whole bunch of reasons, which are fair enough, actually, and some which are not. There are some bad reasons for that, but many of them are fair enough, actually. We deserve to have lost our moral credibility. And that has and a big part of that is our accommodation to capitalism, I would say. And so that movement towards, that I described before, of unlearning capitalism and relearning a new form of economic life is one way of beginning to get a new political imagination, but also regain some moral credibility. And that might mean, and I think it probably does mean, I don't want to say this too strongly because context is complex and there's all sorts of exceptions, but I generally think it means we can't be preachy Christians in the public sphere at the moment, not because for multiple reasons. Well, one, because that's just not going to be accepted. It's going to do more harm than good to the message that we want to convey. It can't be heard. I just don't think, even at our best attempts, sometimes religious words, and I've had experiences of this myself, even with the richest meanings that we can give them and try and explain ourselves best, when you use those words, they just can't be heard by some people. If someone's been abused by a priest, for example, then attaching any sort of religious language to the language, a person like that may not be able to hear what you're saying. So we need to find a different language. We need to be able to translate And that is the work of knowing your faith in as rich and a nuanced enough way that you can speak about it in multiple idioms, rather than just a simple Christianese idiom that might communicate on a Sunday morning at church, probably less so than we think, actually. But being actually able to speak in the common language. C.S. Lewis once said something like, it's easy to talk about religion in the learned language, but to speak about it in the common language requires that you have to really know what you're talking about.
Thank you so much. Can we move on to talking about hope, which is why we're here? Even though I think the last, I feel like this vision of the moral vision of what Christians can create could be the hope. But so this podcast is about hope, and we'd like to talk about how, in light of your learning and study and life, where you find hope, what that looks like for you, where do you draw your hope from?
Okay, big question. Yep.
Yeah.
So there are, I guess, a couple of different levels which I'd want to answer that question. One, let me just be honest and say that hope is often difficult in this world for me. So I'm going to say where I find hope, but I think I need to be honest and say, as I think most people are, I feel the weight of the times that we live in very strongly. And there are times when I do despair, but it's never complete. And I think it's just important to be honest about that. Hope, I do see hope, but I'm not an optimist. Let me also be clear about that. I distinguish hope very clearly from optimism. Optimism is about the idea that things will pan out and things will come together, and I just don't. I can't feel optimistic about the world in which we live in at the moment. Hope is based largely on the things we cannot see, on the things that are hidden from our sight. Except at the first level of which I find hope, there are a few different levels. The first level I find hope is a sort of a bit of a refrain of mine has become that hope is local and despair is global. So whenever, when we abstract and we aggregate, we look at the world in the big picture, it just seems hopeless. It seems that's where we despair. If we want to find hope, we need to look at the particular, at the non-abstract, at the things close to us, at how the action that this person has just taken to help another person, and what this community has done and what's happening there. And I think there we can see at the ground level, we can see the movements of the Spirit, whether they be amongst the Christian community or broader than that. So we need hope is local. We look for it in the particular. Again, so the idea that hope is very much also to be found in the unseen. I think, we see the news that we get communicates all the bad news to us, and that's our sources of communication in the world are biased towards that. And in fact, neuroscience shows that our brains are actually wired to receiving bad messages more than good messages. So there's a lot that's hidden from our sight, whether that's both at the personal relation, at the smallest level of a relationship, right up to global affairs. There's much that we don't see, and we just don't know how to weight what's happening in those unseen movements of in human hearts and in the work that the Spirit's doing amongst people in the world. So I think I put a lot of store of hope in those unseen movements. And I think history testifies that new movements of renewal often come up unexpectedly from unseen places. The historian could look back and say, they came from here and here. But at the time, it's like, where did this come from? Because people had not observed that movement happening, but it was there. There's these deep tectonic movements. So I think there's hope in that. Finally, my hope is, and look, I don't want to sound trite about this, but it is also eschatological. And I continually, I remind myself of this, that at the heart of Christian hope is the idea that, in the language of Paul, all labour for the good is not in vain. So whether we can see whether it's successful or not, quote unquote, in our terms is one thing. But Paul says, whatever it is, if you're working for the good, it's not in vain. And that's a statement of faith, I guess. So faith and hope have to go together. They can't have hope without faith. And so they're my three levels of, or ways of thinking about hope.
Mm. Are you okay with the controversial question?
Sure, okay. Does scare me a bit.
Go as shallow or as deep as you like, to be honest.
The question at its core is just, what is your most controversial opinion? And put that differently, if you're in a room with a group of people from your field, what's something you think that you disagree with everyone else about?
I'll take that as, say, the group of people as, let's say, theologians, the sorts of one area where you might think from the way I've been talking and the way a lot of people might slot me is in the broad field of, let's call it, the progressive left. There's a lot of, as I've just been talking, there's a lot of things like points of common agreement I can find in that world, but I don't identify with the progressive left. And I have plenty of points of disagreement. And at heart, at a very deep level, it's because I don't believe in progress, which is right at the heart of the progressive movement, which is, I think, on the left, now the dominant form of the left. It wasn't always, the left wasn't always necessarily that way. So there would be plenty of points where I'd find significant disagreement, and that goes to the core of how we think about the human person and our anthropology, where our ethics comes from and what human ethics is. So I would want to see ethics as actually rooted in reality, in creation, not just as constructs that humans create based on whichever way our wills are inclined now, and our common agreement. I see so that's actually controversial when you start to push what that means. So I would differ from a lot of, I guess, even theologians who incline to the progressive left these days at that level, even though we could find many points of agreement on things as well. How's that for an answer?
Thank you so much. The last question we usually ask is about what books you're reading at the moment, but also what books have been formational for you throughout your life that you would recommend for young people such as us to read.
Okay. Okay. I'll say what I'm reading at the moment. That's a quick answer. So I've just finished reading an excellent PhD thesis on Luke chapter 19, which is the story of Zacchaeus and the parable of the pounds. Yeah, really good unpacking of the economic worldview of that Luke's gospel. And I'm also reading a book by Ben Witherington, a New Testament scholar, on Jesus and money, which is okay. It's okay. It's not quite strong enough for my liking. And then I'm reading a history book, a social history called The Common People by a guy called G.H.D. Cole, who was a socialist back in the early 20th century. And it's a history of social change, the change for the common people in Britain, 1746 to 1946. So it's a social history. That's what I'm reading now. Books that I would recommend that have been important for me, that I would recommend. So I mentioned R.H. Tawney before. He's a bit of a hero of mine. His books, Religion on the Rise of Capitalism, has been really, I love that book. It's a standout book. It still holds its own historically, even though there's been a lot of work done since. And he's just such a good writer. His book, The Acquisitive Society, which is his early socialist manifesto, non-Marxist socialist manifesto. If you want an idea of what that looks like, you could read that. Book by his close friend, the Archbishop William Temple, which is called Christianity and the Social Order. It's a short, just a little book about how Christians can think about economic and political life. I think it's quite an easy book to read, and I think it's quite a good introduction into that world. So if the stuff is fairly new, it's a good way into that sort of stuff. I think some of Ched Meyer's stuff, I don't know if people have encountered, some of his stuff's quite hard to read, but there's a little book that he's written called Godspeed, the Year of the Jubilee, and it's on Sabbath economics. And it's a really good little introduction to just unpacking different snippets of, so he talks about the manna story in the Old Testament, and he talks about a couple of parables of Jesus, and then how Paul talks about economics in quite easy to read. And, it's a short book. I would recommend that to anyone as a sort of introduction to biblical economics, as a way of sort of learning a new way of thinking about the Bible. How's that for a few?
Thank you so much. Mika's going to go back. Can I ask you one more question that it's just a quick question. So I'm reading a book at the moment that's called, it's an academic book, and it's a combination of anthropology and religious studies. It's called Markets of Sorrow, Labours of Faith. I don't know if you've heard of it. And in this book, the anthropologist is studying the response to the Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans through studying market forces and the way that the government essentially paid private contractors to help fix everything. They fucked it up. It was very bad. And she contrasts that with these literally thousands and thousands of Christians which turned up and did all this volunteer work and all this work for free and donated billions of dollars. Christians across the world donated billions of dollars to help people get back on their feet. And so there's this really stark contrast. She uses this contrast to illustrate how religion, specifically Christianity, in living an alternative, essentially accidentally upholds the current system through doing this. So she was kind of saying because Christians filled the gaps which was left by these massive companies. It's because they filled the gaps and did all the work for free and donated so much money that these companies could essentially get away with what they did. And she was kind of saying that as Christians begin to make these alternatives and create these structures, because capitalism is so all-encompassing, Christians can't help but continue to uphold and maintain that through their acts of philanthropy and charity and volunteering and free labor. I was just wondering if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I get that. So that's not that form of argument is not an old argument, and it comes out of some what is the utilitarian left, if you like. And look, I think there are things to be paid attention to in that argument. So this has been one of the arguments against food banks, for example. Food banks just prop up a system in which a whole bunch of people don't have enough because of economic structural reasons, and we're just propping that system up by helping them live. I think it's good to think, well, what if we didn't do that? What are they arguing that? Do we just let those people, in that particular instance in Cyclone Katrina, are you really saying, let's just let this be a ginormous humanitarian tragedy and let all these people suffer for the sake of our satisfaction about letting the economic system deal with itself? So I think there are aspects the critique is we need to pay attention to it. And what it suggests to me is that unless we're challenging the system by which market contracting is, so this is a neoliberal system in which political system, unless we're challenging it, all the work, the work of charity and so on is propping up a system. If we're not challenging it, then we're just sopping. We're just sops for a bad system. So I don't take from that, don't do good stuff to help people out in dire need. I take that if you're going to do that, you also need to be politically active and outspoken. You need to be working towards political change, and you need to use what you're using, the knowledge that you're gaining from being involved. So in that case, the people working at the ground level in Katrina to say, this is how they are fucked up royally, and the world needs to know about this. Or if that's in our, in the broken food system we have in our countries, that's saying this is how people are actually living and why they're showing up at our food banks and so on. And these are, has to do with housing, and that has to do with how people are into real estate investors and things like that. Unless we're naming those sorts of things and being politically active about them, then we are being sops. And I think so. I want to say a bit of a yes, but a bit of, I wouldn't want to take it in the direction that so we shouldn't do good things in the world, because that's a very utilitarian argument. And it's sort of an ideologically purist argument. I'm suspect of all the forms of ideological puritanism, whether they're religious or non-religious.
I think for me, I found the argument interesting because it resonated with how much it feels so suffocating, the system, and how it does sometimes feel like no matter what I do or how I live, capitalism is all-encompassing and self-corrective. If it gets a wobble, it's self-corrective and rightens itself up. I don't know. It just, it's so tricky sometimes.
Yeah. I mean, the thing I didn't get to say, it is all-encompassing, but I think that we didn't actually get to clarify this. I don't think all things are capitalism. So there is actually lots of space, and the way we've talked about the idea of Christian alternative economic communities, there are all sorts of non-capitalism, these sort of air pockets, if you like, within the capitalist world that still exist free from that, or not free because that they still exist within the broader system, but are not capitalism. And one way of thinking about it is we want to expand those air pockets of all the non-capitalisms because they provide the places where, that, if you like, the refuges and the habitats by which people will relearn different ways of thinking and the new forms of politics by which we're going to challenge the system. We need to have those spaces, those air pockets, the habitat refuges by which we can then go out and challenge the system. Yeah, so it is all-encompassing, but it's not as well. I think not all things are capitalism. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your time. It's been wonderful. Great.
Pleasure. It's fun. I enjoyed your questions. So thank you, and thank you for giving me time to rabbit on about this stuff.
Really good to unpack it in some more detail. I think. Yeah.